Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to take on a loaded topic of race and ADHD and what we can learn from the study of it. I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have questions while I'm talking, you can type them in. You can also ask questions later when this is posted on YouTube or Facebook. So I usually start with the take-home message, and that is the very concept of race is both socially and scientifically fraught, and it is a sociologic or social construct rather than a biological one. I'll get to that. Contrary to what many are claiming, most of what we see worldwide is actually fairly similar rates of ADHD across different countries with different racial makeups. And in the US, in contrast, we have rather marked racial differences in both diagnosis and treatment of ADHD, and they may not be the way you think they are. So, jumping first into the loaded topic of race, and some people still hold on to the concept of race as a purely biological concept, that we have distinctly different genetic populations and we can link them with different colored skin. And the more science and genetic genealogists have looked at things, a couple big factors jump out. One is that particularly those of us who live in countries where there's mixed racial populations, most of us as individuals, if you look at our genetic heritage, trace our genetic heritage to a variety of different geographic sources or tribes or locations back in time. So very few of us are pure anything. And when we've also looked at a group level at genetics, there is more variability among what we lump as one race of black people than there is between different racial, or comparing different racial groups. So the disparity, or the racial variation within white people actually falls within, it's a subset of the racial variation seen across black people. So that makes a biological concept of race just meaningless. If there is more variation, if one black person taken at random from the black population is less likely to be related to them than a white. So again, the gap or the difference between two different random black people is likely to be larger than the difference between a white person and a black person. That doesn't even, when you say that, it doesn't make sense to anyone who's trying to hold onto a concept of black or white, yellow races. So it highlights, again, that the ridiculousness of using it as a biological concept. It's certainly a social concept, and I'm not saying that there is no biological connections. So there is some genetic heritage there, but again, seeing it as immutable, distinct groups doesn't make any sense. So in rather loaded terms, so at one level, this is why racism can be real, while races may not be real. Clearly at a social level, if you look at arrest rates, if you look at housing, if you look at income, if you look at the likelihood of someone to be hired for a job, if you look at the likelihood of someone to be laws that are being passed to discriminate people from voting, there are clear, robust trends of racial discrimination. People might not like me saying it. There may be some people who believe that white people are the discriminated group in America. The facts, very consistently, by anyone who's looked at them, would refute that. I won't go into the politics more right now. I'm just sticking to the facts behind that statement. So enough about that on race as a prelude. So one of the big topics with race and ethnicity and ADHD that's come up is the claim, and this was prevalent 20, 30 years ago, still there now, and despite the evidence that I'll get into, is that ADHD is a construct of either Western psychiatry or Western thought, or more nefariously that it's a product of the pharmacologic industry trying to create ADHD so we can drug more kids. And the claims were, you see lots of ADHD in the US, maybe in Europe, but you don't see it anywhere else in the world. When you look elsewhere in the world, that statement is just false. And several different studies done in different ways suggest that actually we see fairly similar, not identical, rates of ADHD across a multitude of different racial groups, different countries, different ethnic origins, with about 7 to 10% of kids in most countries testing as positive for ADHD, and roughly 3 to 5% of adults if you use the same criteria when you're testing. So that is not saying that different cultures may have different stigma against these traits we are currently discuss or lump as or describe as ADHD. It doesn't mean that, again, the acceptance of these traits may vary. How the cultures are successful in incorporating people with different neurotypical differences certainly may vary. But at some level, this entity doesn't seem to be created by the drug industry, doesn't seem to be absent in any area of the world, doesn't seem to be present in wildly discrepant rates anywhere. That doesn't, again, mean that some countries may not have higher rates. There was a flurry of activity more 10, 15 years ago examining rates that were countries that were high in rates of immigration, so the US, Australia, Israel, and those do seem to cluster at the high end of the rates of ADHD in the general population. I'm not going to say too much more about that. About that general trend. So one of the correlations, or one of the things people have been looked at, is there's, again, I talked last week, there's a multitude of dopamine receptors, the dopamine type 4 receptor system, and particularly a region of the genome for that receptor may have multiple repeats within it, and a 7 repeat section has been in multiple studies been one of the genetic factors linked with ADHD. Again, this is not a problem with the dopamine 4 receptor causes ADHD. All the evidence suggests it is hundreds of different genetic factors, each of which are playing only a tiny, tiny role. But this is one of the identified ones, and this dopamine 4 receptor may be more than just a tiny, maybe a small role in it. So there are multiple studies supporting the contention that migrant populations are more likely to have that 7 repeat section. Some studies seem to suggest that same 7 repeat section, the dopamine 4 receptor, is linked with greater risk-taking. Other studies don't find that, but many studies, particularly in Caucasian, so European and American, North and South populations, that 7 repeat variant of the dopamine 4 receptor is linked statistically with ADHD. In other regions, particularly in Middle East regions, it's actually correlated with lower rates of ADHD. But there's some evidence that there may be some populations, there may be genetic indicators that there are certain populations that are slightly more predisposed. Again, the claim or the ethnohistory is that maybe people who are more prone to novelty, more prone to not sitting down and settling in one thing, more prone to so traits that we identify now as part of ADHD may have led to certain groups of people being more represented in certain populations. But again, at a worldwide level, we're not seeing great discrepancies. One other side issue I'll talk about there is that there's fairly a large resistance among the ADHD researchers that there has been a global trend towards increasing rates of ADHD, and most of that has been attributed to greater recognition, greater awareness and diagnosis and treatment. I think those are true and valid factors, but there's almost a fear that if rates were actually increasing, that would disprove the existence of ADHD as a valid scientific or psychiatric condition. And that fear just seems ridiculous to me, because what are we seeing in the last 2 years? During COVID, during shutdown, we're seeing a clear external environmental condition that caused stress and duress on lots of people, and lots of expectation, some measurable increases in depression, anxiety, substance abuse conditions, all of which we treat as valid psychiatric conditions, have shown increases. So again, because a condition has a biological origin or underpinning, doesn't mean it's going to be impervious to all environmental conditions. In other words, it's always nature and nurture, not just one or the other. So given that I argue, and many others have argued in slightly different ways, but I would argue specifically our world has become an ADHD-ogenic world. There are so many factors, with social media at the top of the list, which are encouraging us to react more quickly, less thoughtfully, more spontaneously, to jump to conclusions, to be suffused with emotional dysregulation rather than quiet, contemplative consideration. So I would argue that raising children in those environments would be expected to increase the actual rate of an actual condition called ADHD. So that's one of the topics I was going to talk about with race and ethnicity and ADHD. The other one is what's going on not across different countries, but within the US. And there's an often repeated claim that ADHD is just a stigmatizing label thrown on little black boys, particularly over energetic children, to pathologize them, to punish them, to make them behave like white kids, and that we are overdiagnosing, overtreating, over-medicating, and that itself is having a bad impact on the black community. The actual data tends to be substantially not in support of that. So what does the data suggest? And there's a few recent studies maybe showing differences, but the data overall for decades has shown white people are at least 2 or 3 times as likely to receive a diagnosis of ADHD as a black person, and more likely to be treated with medications if you're white than if you're black. And again, there's numbers of studies, most robustly among adults with ADHD, but also with kids. There have been some recent trends showing maybe the increase in diagnosis of black kids with ADHD is increasing and may in some areas actually match the rate in white kids, but those studies are so far not representative of the whole group of studies. And a couple other things should be mentioned here. One is ADHD does show marked differences if you look at different states' Medicaid rolls, in terms of there are great local variations in this diagnosis, and those probably do not represent completely total differences in the likelihood of the underlying biological condition, but are social factors, and I will get to those social racial factors in a second. And I'm certainly not saying that there are no black kids anywhere who have been overdiagnosed, overtreated, because I'm sure that's happening, but that also happens with every condition, not the black, but any medical condition. I mean, we make some mistakes by overdiagnosing, we make some mistakes by underdiagnosing. From what I see as a clinician, I'm not pretending I'm seeing the whole world or a representative sampling, but I see among adults, wildly, way more many adults who have had their ADHD missed than have come in who claim to have ADHD and didn't really have it. So I still see in this country, particularly among adults, an underdiagnosis problem rather than overdiagnosis. So getting back to the discrepancy we're seeing in the US, is it really that ADHD is only half as common among black people as in white people? Probably not. And the data we have do show, so again, the discrepancy in rates probably means we are actually missing lots of black kids with ADHD. And again, that we are undertreating them, and we know that effective treatment for ADHD actually prevents problems like drug abuse, prevents problems like suicide, prevents excessive death rates and accidents and other problems. So we're probably doing a harm by undertreating. So getting back to why there may be discrepancies, and again, the social factors involved here, there have been, and in contrast to some of the other things with ADHD, this is an area that there's a fair amount of research. So one, if you're just showing people videotapes of black kids, white kids who have ADHD, and you ask teachers, ask parents to assess, who has ADHD symptoms or what's going on, we can see discrepancies. White teachers are more likely to diagnose black kids, and again, in this setting of just looking at a videotape of a kid. We also know that studies would suggest that black parents in some situations are more likely than white parents to pick up on or note both inattentive and overactive symptoms in videotapes of kids, black or white, who do or don't have ADHD. So there's some evidence, actually, my interpretation would be that racism makes people more attuned to singling out other people for their differences or some of it's fear of you're going to be singled out and judged, but it also may make you more adept at judging real differences that are going on there. So again, there have been some studies that have found black parents, particularly those black parents who were themselves more victim or subject to racism, were more adept at picking out ADD symptoms in kids than white parents were, or black parents who had less subjective discrimination in their life. Again, so what happens at the evaluation level or what happens in the classroom is not what we're seeing overall yet at a society level. Again, teachers are more likely to assess a kid who's black as having ADHD than their parents might. So part of what's going on, getting back to the topic of racism, is that overall, so I'll cite there's a study in Northern California published 2 years ago by Kaiser. It was considered a good study because they have an extensive computer network system. They examined more than 6 million kids. They were looking at trends from, I think, about 2006 to 2017, so over more than a decade. Rates of ADHD, and this was across all age groups, went up significantly for all age groups. But the rates went from about 1%. So rates went up to about 5% of whites, about 2% of blacks or Hispanics, And again, those were twice as high as what they had been a decade earlier, but they're actually suggesting that a huge proportion of black individuals and Hispanic individuals, we are missing the diagnosis of ADHD, because when you do rigorous studies with rigorous evaluation models in a sort of single classroom or single community, the percentage of black people, this percentage of white kids seem to have similar rates of ADHD diagnosis. But again, what's winding up in treatment is substantially fewer black people. And again, this suggests we are missing lots of people, and it's probably bias on doctors. It's also not just bias as to how they're being evaluated once they get in the system. It's also bias in terms of who's even getting into the system and who's being evaluated. And yes, there are big confounds between race and socioeconomic status and access to insurance, but even when you try to control for some of these discrepancies still come out. So that's about all I'm going to say today. Again, well, one other thing I think I left out when I was talking about dopamine 4 receptor variants, genetic variants, and one of the interesting things, getting back to the nature versus nurture, this really highlights it, is that among kids who have this 7 repeat marker, which again is a predictor or indicator of potential future ADHD, the likelihood of whether the kid developed ADHD symptomatology was affected by the type of parenting they got. And so more conscientious, attentive, attuned parents who were trying to match what was going on with their kids and attentive to it, rather than being rejecting or missing cues or harsh or abusive, not necessarily harsh or aversive to their kids. So that beautifully exemplifies that there is, even if there are biological propensities, they are not pure determinants, and how you are treated by your family and by the world growing up can make you a healthier, happier person or a more miserable, dysfunctional one. So we should all continue to work at reducing racism in our own interactions in our own lives and calling it out when we see it. And that's about all I'm going to say right now. Next week's topic is Ritalin. Is it really a stimulant? That's all for now. I'm not seeing any questions coming up, so I'm going to stop here.